Because your book is about two big failures, right? Your book is about the failure of capitalism. Your book is also about the failure of democracy. And, I used to joke back in the good old George W. Bush days that the way to actually understand what was being proposed was to substitute the word capitalism whenever George Bush said democracy. And I forget what the other one was. But, and so we've been told for a very long time, and I remember this from, ye old 1990s, that capitalism was the most democratic system ever. And not just in the Cold War era, but literally in the 1990s when, investing in the stock market was equal to democracy. And so it seems like one of the cases that you're making in this book is actually not that capitalism and democracy don't work well together, but that literally at this point, the capitalism that we live under is fundamentally incompatible with democracy.
Let me put it in a very similar way, but to say that capitalism cannot be good without democracy, and neither can socialism. Right? I mean, the fact of the matter is, it is the lack of democracy that hands our power away to somebody else without any kind of return on it. And the crisis in America is that we tell ourselves we have a functional democracy. We certainly do not.
Who tells us, John? Who tells us?
Oh, you know what? The fact of the matter is, we the people, actually still have immense faith in this thing. And it's a wonderful thing. I see it all the time. Not everybody, but a lot of people actually believe that somehow that's the way to fix stuff, right? And what they don't recognize is the extent to which we have structurally created barriers to it working. And so you end up with, yes, immense numbers of people kind of extracting themselves from the process. I'll give you the example. What is the measure of a successful democracy? Number one, its simplest measure is participation. Does everybody think it's worth being a part of it? Do you want to actually, jump in the game? And do you think something's going to come of this? Well, in America, we've actually had an election on democracy, right? On whether our democracy works to a level that people would say, yeah, I want to be a part of that. And in presidential elections, about half of us, little over, we do a little better in a good election season, but roughly half of us don't vote, or are barred from voting, or are undermined in their efforts to vote. But huge numbers of people don't vote. And where you get to the real stuff, the real meat of the matter, the people that make day-to-day decisions about your lives, down in state elections and local elections, local elections around this country are in absolute crisis. The turnout levels are so bad, so small, that it's like barely notable. I mean, this is a big, big deal. And it's exactly what Ben Bagdikian predicted in 1997 in one of his intros to Media Monopoly. Ben Bagdikian said, if you start to cull out local journalism across this country, if you close newspapers, if you close down newsrooms, if you keep cutting down the flow of information and giving people a decent amount of information at the top level, but nothing about where they live, right? They will slowly begin to participate less and less and less. Do you know, I cover politics for a living. I go across this country. Do you know what people say to me all the time? They say, these are people who are involved in politics. They say, our number one problem is no one anymore knows who their city council member is, or who their school board member is, or when the election is. And I say, well, yeah, but people were always imperfect. They said, no. It used to be an election, even every local election, it was sort of a festival. It was announced in advance. There was a theater that went with it. There was all sorts of reality. As we have changed our media system in this country, we have done all sorts of things that extract people from the process. And this gets to this guy's thing, which is a really important thing. In a good democracy, in a functional democracy, people say, oh, I got a problem. I need to solve this problem. Now, if you're very, very rich and you have a problem, in this society, you have a lot of ways to solve it. You can buy your way out of it. You can buy a politician. You can shape the policy debate, all sorts of opportunities. But if you've got nothing or almost nothing in this society, your ways of going up and changing things, of addressing it, seem very, very limited. We ask ourselves why turnout is so low among certain groups in society. I would suggest to you an analysis that says one of the reasons their turnout is so low is because they genuinely don't believe that they can affect any change. And why is turnout so high among wealthy folks? Wealthy folks do tend to vote because this is it's like icing on the cake. You've bought the politicians. Now I think I'll actually, it's sort of like close the deal. I'll vote for them too. But the fact of the matter is we are in crisis as a democracy. We should understand that. And the measure of the crisis this year is the fact that the most successful political message of this year is, I'm against them all. And I heard this wonderful thing. Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders are debating with one another about who's more establishment, right? And Hillary Clinton say, well, Bernie Sanders, he's served as a mayor and he's been in Congress and stuff like that. So he's part of the establishment too. And it's this notion that you have to find some way to say even the 74-year-old Democratic socialist from Vermont is too much a part of the establishment in America. That's last stage politics, right? That's not the start of something new. That's the end of something old. That is trying to tell people that the best response to the crisis is to believe that everything's what they don't like. The best response to the crisis is to think about why people don't believe democracy works for them, and why it's so relevant to this book is that we are coming toward a moment where our only way out is great big democracy. We talk way too much about big data, big business, big money. We talk way too little about big democracy. And I will promise you this, if we don't have big democracy in this country very soon, we will be the feudal serfs of corporate capital.
Those of us who aren't already. So you kind of took the wind out of my sails talking about Ben Bagdikian and the media monopoly and this. I'm going to give a shout out to Andy Mendelson, who has taught me in journalism school and had me reading Nichols and McChesney. But one of the things that you're arguing in this book to try to fix things is that we need to rebuild the infrastructure of democracy, and media, of course, is one of those things.
Well, we're talking, we're doing an interesting walk here where we're telling you about a lot of the problems we have before we talk about the core problem, which is good. And then as we talk about how we get out of this, because this is a happy story. But this is the interesting thing about America. Thomas Jefferson was an incredibly imperfect president, and he's frankly an incredibly imperfect guy. Yes. All men are created equal, problematic even there because, not everybody's a guy. Problematic also because you seem to have a blind spot as regards the slavery issue. So, I'm not here to tell you Jefferson was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but I will tell you this. Jefferson thought a lot about how the American experiment might improve. I take my lessons about Jefferson from Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we looked at Jefferson not for what he did always, but for what he told us we could do. And this is one of the most interesting things that Jefferson said. He said that one of the worst things you could do to the next generation is to lock it into a constitution from a previous generation. To say that, you must live your life under the set of rules developed by people who treated illness by bleeding themselves, and who accepted human bondage, and who literally traveled by foot because they had no other means of transportation. With all due respect, some things have changed since then, and yet we are locked into a political system and a political structure that still responds to rapid 21st century change with all sorts of barriers to making any kind of response functional and quick and wise and inclusive. And so we end up with this situation. I've always believed the story of America is the story of expanding democracy. It's a wondrous story. I mean, tiny number. The people in this room, if you had a congressional election at the founding of this country, the people in this room would have been sufficient to choose. You'd be the wealthy planters who had gathered in a room in Williamsburg, Virginia, to choose, or some town in Virginia down a little south of there, to choose between James Madison and James Monroe. And, of course, the women couldn't vote. The people of color couldn't vote. In some cases, religious minorities couldn't vote. And certainly poor people couldn't vote, right? So you had everybody on the outside looking in. And they say, the histories of that time, they say that when an election was held, you would hear a cheer go up from the people outside if somebody they liked got elected. And they actually were engaged enough to watch it. They were full-on spectators. Politics was a sport. And you were very, very engaged, and you actually had favorites, right? So it's not like these are stupid people. These are not like these are disengaged people. It's not like these are people that aren't a part of things. It's just they're not allowed to have any say. Well, we built beyond that, right? We opened things up. We brought more people in. But what I would argue is that in the last 50 years, where we actually started to achieve something akin to full democracy in this country, then we started to erect a whole new set of barriers. And it's not just voter ID laws or all the other things that we talk about so much, which are completely legitimate concerns. And my friend Ari Berman's written a brilliant book about, trying to renew the Voting Rights Act and all sorts of struggles there. It's not just money in politics. Bob and I have written books about money in politics and dollarocracy and these things. These are all relevant, but we have fundamental structural flaws that make democracy not function in America. And we have people in the room here tonight who've worked on some of those structural flaws and tried to address them. And what I would suggest to you is this is huge stuff. We write a lot in the book about when this country was still young and when this country still believed in the 1940s, in the 1960s, 1970s. And in those days, conversations about democratic infrastructure were everywhere. People were talking about democratic infrastructure all the time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave his speeches about, literally, a second Bill of Rights. And he talked about literally how you would make democracy work. And do you know what he said? We got to have economic democracy along with political democracy. Because the great crisis of our times, in his era, was that decisions about the economy, decisions about our economic life, had been pulled away from the people. And thus they were being made on high by elites. Roosevelt said of those elites, I welcome their hatred. I'm ready to take them on. The people loved him for that. Now, it happened when Roosevelt outlined a second Bill of Rights, he didn't say that democracy was simply about, having elections. He said democracy was about having the resources, the capacity in your life, the job, the work, the housing, the health care, all of these other things that freed you to participate fully and to be fully engaged in our political life. And he said these were barriers too. It's wonderful when you study where Roosevelt was at. And you know what the interesting thing is? We took him seriously. And so as we moved forward in the 50s and the 60s, what you saw was expansion of democratic participation, but you also saw addressing huge issues. The poverty of the elderly with Medicare, the poverty of, so many folks with Medicaid, the war on poverty itself, influenced by Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington walking around the White House. A. Philip Randolph, one of the great socialists in American history, sitting in the Oval Office with the President of the United States. People really talking about radical changes in our economic life to make real our politics, to make our politics consequential. It got so far. We got so close. And then power said, hold it, this thing's getting out of control. We write in the book about Lewis Powell's memo, the famous memo where Lewis Powell he said to wealthy people as a corporate lawyer, said, look, we've got to get involved in politics. We have to start, asserting our wealth, or the next thing you know, people like Ralph Nader and Jesse Jackson and, all these radicals and all these activists, they're going to start guiding our country. And do you know what? One of the things that influenced Lewis Powell to be so concerned? He was from Virginia. He was very influenced by the ads on television that said smoking was dangerous for you, and then the end of tobacco advertising. And he and other people said, look, if you can force companies to stop advertising for stuff just because it kills them, the next thing you know, they're going to be saying that we got a right to health care, we have a right to food, or we have, that we're human beings. Everybody's a human being. We got to fight against that. We got to do something about that. And we have seen over the last 40 years a diminution of democracy in America. The problem is now we are at a point where our democracy is not sufficiently vibrant and functional to deal with the radical economic changes that are coming our way.